renamed by continent, so nice to have Asia dealing with Latin America. I want to give you just 2 seconds on who we are and why having UNA, this area here, is something relevant to us, and why the topic of this panel is relevant to us. So Interaction is the primary hub of the U.S. NGO sector that works overseas. So this is a group of NGOs that are large and small, several hundred of them. They manage close to $16 billion of resources a year. And what's interesting of that is only about 24% of that comes from the U.S. government. That makes the rest, actually the U.S. NGO sector, the 4th largest donor in the world. And we, as an independent part of civil society, are then actively trying to influence our government, as well as deliver programs through the resources of our members. And the NGO sector uses Interaction as the place where it develops policies, where it figures out how we engage with the leadership of the UN, how we engage with Congress, and so forth. We're probably one of the primary advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals up on Capitol Hill. And over 30 years, we've built a bipartisan basis for the understanding of this subset of U.S. foreign action or overseas, and that it is in essence, an American thing to do to care about these programs. And because of that, we found that when the president came in and slashed things by 40%, we could, but a few senators working with them, you put the money all back in and you do it again. On other things, we failed, or we have at a policy level, most of the refugee resettlement agencies in the U.S. are members of Interaction, and on refugee policy and other policies, we've been not as successful. We have been successful in defending parts of our community, the Muslim-based parts of our community, and so forth, and ensuring a common front of engagement. But the core message here is whether the U.S. government engages in certain areas, the U.S. NGO sector is actively investing, is down in Central America, is actively involved along caravan routes, is across the border in Mexico, is on this side of the border working with domestic groups, is in the resettlement business, and is in the advocacy business for resources associated with this. So in a time where there is a dissonance and significant gap with an administration, our position is we will continue to push back and fight against things that we don't believe in, and will do so based on principles that cut all the way from the conservative church-based members we have into the progressive Oxfams and CARES and others, but we will do this as an expression of the American people's interest in these issues. So whether or not our government cares and will act on certain things is one thing. What we can't say is that American civil society doesn't care, and American civil society isn't acting, it isn't trying to do its best it can from the small role we play, and that role isn't that small. But part of this is we use this space for dialogue among members and others, and just wanted to welcome you and welcome the panel to at least know where you're having this conversation, and thank you for the chance to do so.
Thank you, Sam, indeed. Thank you very much. It's an important venue to be at, and I'm the volunteer president of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, and I won't talk too much about it, except to say it's part of a growing network of people across the country and across the world. There are some 200 chapters here. We're about 1,200 people. We're people who, like you, are devoted to increasing the understanding by the American public about what the engagement means of the U.S. with the United Nations and how to improve on that as we go forward. And as Sam alluded to, it's been a challenging couple of years to not only understand those issues, but to ensure that the critical programs that the UN conducts in cooperation with other international organizations is funded satisfactorily, since it is in many ways dependent for about a quarter of its operations on U.S. contributions. And they've never been questioned so much as they have been in the last 2 years. But with, I think, the NGO community, the university community, the political community across the country and the leaders, actually, of our on a bipartisan basis have continued to support critically these issues. Where they haven't been focused is a little bit about what tonight's discussion is on. Or they haven't been enough focused on that. And I want to thank Sergio Martinez, who is the chairman of our Sustainable Development Committee. That's almost equivalent to the SDGs. And that's the platform, frankly, that has helped to guide a lot of our work here in this chapter of the United Nations Association over the past 5 years, recognizing that it's the integration of peace and stability and social investment and economic investment that have to go hand in hand. And I think in many ways that's the platform about which this constructive discussion is. It's gotten so political, we've forgotten about the longer term and the immediate term needs. And this committee has brought us together and brought together this wonderful panel. My job really is to move from beyond talking generally about the United Nations Association to introducing the moderator tonight, who in turn is going to introduce the extraordinary panel, and then Sergio is going to bring it to a close with a few comments at the end. And will you then also recognize, let me just ask, put up the hands of some of the committee members who work with Sergio. Fantastic. Thank you very much for doing this. This is part of a series of programs that will focus actually on Central American migration and policy change over the course of this year as well. So we're starting it out tonight. Michael Camilleri is the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law Program Director at the Inter-American Dialogue. I'm old enough that I know Peter Bell, who was a leading member of the executive committee at this institution, Interaction, when he was president of CARE, so we're joined at the hip in many in varied ways tonight. He's also been on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning staff and Director of Indian Affairs at the National Security Council from 2017 to 2018. That's the former Obama administration, I want to point out. And before joining the U.S. government in those roles, he was a human rights specialist at the Organization of American States. So, U.S. State Department, the Organization of American States, Inter-American Dialogue. He's the perfect moderator tonight, bringing us together on this subject. Hails, I suspect, from Guatemala, although I haven't actually known that.
That's Claudia.
Okay, well, you can correct me then. And has his law degree from Harvard and his bachelor's in history from the University of Notre Dame. And I'm so pleased that you're here. You're regularly on media talking about these issues, so we're very delighted that you're here chairing and moderating our panel tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate the kind introduction. I actually hail from Malta, which is a place even smaller than Guatemala. But I lived in Guatemala, left part of my heart there. So it's,
okay.
I have a lot of admiration for people like Claudia who are doing amazing work trying to make their country better. It really is a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation from UNA, from Interaction, especially from good friend Sergio, and delighted to be joined by 3 friends and esteemed colleagues. So looking forward to this conversation. I think can you all hear in the back? No? More? Is that a microphone or is it a camera? Both? Okay. All right, we'll try to project. There's been mention made, I think, of a certain caravan already, which was in the news. You may have heard a few months ago. And while it was exploited for political purposes, in that context, I think it did also refocus us on Central America and on the issues, especially in the Northern Triangle, that continue to cause citizens from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to flee their countries in search of a better life. And I think the other thing that certainly unites those countries is they are places where the international community and the United States in particular has been engaged over the course of many years in different guises and with different approaches. But certainly in recent years, with the objective of promoting development, democracy, rule of law, trying to get at some of those root causes of the reasons that people, citizens of those countries have been forced to leave, felt like they needed to leave. And in some cases we've met with a degree of success, and in other cases we've been frustrated in those efforts. So I think those are some of the issues that we are well placed to explore with our panelists, and I'm sure you all have insights and questions and comments that we'll be sure to incorporate into the discussion. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Claudia Escobar is currently a Centennial Fellow at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, also a former magistrate of the Court of Appeals in Guatemala. Jason Marzak is the director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, and Juan Gonzalez is the associate vice president in the Latin American practice at the Cohen Group. He's a former deputy assistant secretary of state for Central America, and also an advisor on the Western Hemisphere to Vice President Biden. So again, wonderful group to be able to dig in on these issues with. Maybe I'll just start in order of in which we're seated here at the table, and start with Juan. Juan, the migration influx that we see currently is not a new thing, nor is a sort of spike or crisis in migration a new thing. When you were in government, we dealt in 2014 with a particular crisis involving unaccompanied children, unaccompanied minors coming from Central America that was outstripping the resources of the U.S. government at that time to really sort of respond to that. And part of the strategy that the Obama administration came up with was focused on an aid package for Central America, and particularly for the Northern Triangle countries, trying to address some of those root causes of migration. Could you just sort of refresh our memory on what the thinking was, what that strategy looked like, what it was trying to achieve, and if you could begin to sort of assess where we are in implementing that strategy and assessing how successful it's been?
Good question. Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that we really don't have a migration problem in the United States. I think a lot of people here agree, and I think when you say that, it sounds political, but it's just fact. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that since the founding of this country, we've benefited from constant flows of migration of people who, sit around the dinner table and say, hey, let's leave everything behind and go to a country where we don't speak the language, where the culture is different, because we are in search of opportunity. In some cases, we heard anecdotes of women that would, before taking the journey, would take birth control pills because there were incidences of rape on the way up. And so for somebody to make that decision, they're either fleeing something or they're going in search of something. But it's something where, everybody knows that migration has actually declined. In fact, in Mexico, the labor market's getting so tight that I think it's Brookings said that by 2050 it'll be zero Mexican migration to the United States. We definitely have a broken immigration system where I think there have been bipartisan proposals, particularly in 2013, that look to address the status of dreamers, provide a path to citizenship to people, and frankly, fix our legal migration system. And then lastly, I think enforce in a very common sense way the responsibility of the government to enforce its border laws and strengthen its border. In 2014, I want to mention that I think the biggest challenge we had in 2014 was, in addition to the large influx that overwhelmed the facilities the Department of Homeland Security had, and the legal considerations that required the Department of Health and Human Services to place people, really the challenge that we saw that we had in the bottleneck to really either processing or reviewing asylum claims or to deport people that did not have a credible asylum claim was frankly the immigration court system, which had been woefully underfunded for years. And essentially, I think what we saw was, there are numerous things, but one that we saw was that human traffickers found a new business model where they would say, your notice to appear in court, that's your green card. when you get that, you can stay, which is of course wrong, but because the immigration court system was so overwhelmed, and because you can only detain somebody for so long, people would be released, and then they would integrate into society, and they would get to a point where it was not seen as appropriate to try to go after somebody who had been here for maybe 10 years and whose only crime was really coming here to search for a better life. And so the focus turned toward, I think, number one, a deterrence that focused on a sense of enforcement priorities to try to get the criminals that were here out. And then I'll tell you a very brief anecdote is when the search happened and we traveled with Vice President Biden to Guatemala in 2014, the guidance from the White House that we had at the moment, which was focused with the overwhelming of our facilities, the guidance was go down to Guatemala and tell the people of the Northern Triangle to stop sending people up to the United States, right? And it was in the Vice President's conversations with the leaders of each of the countries, and Mexico was also there. He essentially turned around and he said, we actually have to do something to address the issues at the source, and it's not enough to ask people to stop sending people up. Actually, you have to address the economic and security issues in these countries. And so he personally championed that big aid package that increased funding in 2015 and 2016 was something that he actually took personal ownership with and drove and even sold to members of Congress, sold to the president. And so it was the only reason we were able to get it done. And I think the model that we use, and then I'll be quiet, is we looked at, I think, some of the lessons learned from Plan Colombia, and I think the most important thing was that the governments of the region had to have skin in the game, meaning that the U.S. wasn't going to be the only one to actually provide assistance. Each of the countries had to also assign their own funding to address some of these issues, whether they were addressing insecurity or problems of governance or lack of economic opportunity. And they, I think number two, was rising to the political crisis at hand. And so because we understood that in some cases there was a predatory elite in some of these countries that benefited from the status quo and who benefited from the remittances that came from from migrants that would go north, that you needed to have a commitment to, in some cases, take political decisions that went against the political interest of the government and sometimes the economic elites in the country, but would help address the root causes. And then I would say the third part is frankly that we had to ensure sustained assistance, so not just kind of negotiating the 1 year or 2 year assistance flows, sustained assistance, ensuring that there was bipartisan support from the U.S. Congress, and that it's something where you had a security side, but you can't, high intensity law enforcement operations can give you tactical victories, but they really don't accomplish anything lasting in the absence of a really thoughtful development approach. And so we had to sell that to Congress, and I would say, just to finish, is I think that it was really hard work to make progress and to get the leaders to continue to push to make progress on these commitments. I would say today you have the men and women of the State Department, USAID, that are continuing to push for these things. But the challenge has been, I think, in some ways political in some of these countries, and the changes that have taken place over the last, I would say, 2 years. The matter of corruption in Guatemala, the undermining of the Anti-Corruption Commission, CICIG, Honduras, just the political infighting between the sitting government and members of the opposition in El Salvador continues to be a challenge of violence that is just incredibly difficult to address. And I think that it's an issue that's not going to be resolved in 1-2 years. These are issues that are almost generational in the efforts to address, but it's something where you have to keep putting points on the board to ensure that political elites remain committed. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. That's great. Rich set of issues for us to explore. I think certainly we'll get to CC later on with Claudia. But maybe just to keep the conversation broad for now, Jason, you've been leading a 4-country Northern Triangle Task Force, which is co-chaired by General Kelly before he was called to other things. I'm sure that dealing with you was easier than dealing with his subsequent boss. But maybe you could just tell us a bit about the task force goals, its recommendations, in light of what Juan was talking about, and we'll take it from there.
Well, first of all, Sam, Steve, Sergio, thank you very much for the invitation. It's Michael, Juan, Claudia, it's great to be on a panel together. This is I really appreciate the United Nations Association for bringing this panel together, because it's also an opportunity for the four of us to have this conversation, which is so rich at this critical moment. It's great to speak after Juan, because I could just say I agree. And what you do, and on top of that, Juan has a 4-month-old son at home. So I only wish I could be as eloquent as Juan is when my daughter was 4 months old. So I agree, and that's amazing, Juan. Let me just pick up on a couple points. One is, I think, I'll go to the task force, but one thing Juan said is we don't have a migration problem. I agree. Actually, I think the problem is that as Juan said, we have a broken immigration system, and so we're actually not able to attract, frankly, the migrants that we need for the U.S. economy to be competitive looking years ahead. Right? You look at Japan and Japan's immigration restrictions and the resulting shortages in the labor force that Japan has had. You take a number of other countries around the world, and so I think actually when you look at the argument in Capitol Hill and Juan was describing, the inability to achieve bipartisan consensus that is playing, going back to even the Gang of Eight 10 years ago. The arguments at Capitol Hill, in my opinion, they're correct, but they're also flawed. I mean, they're arguments about how do we provide pathway to legalization or pathway to citizenship for the undocumented. How do we issues of the dreamers, all incredibly important. But also the conversation should also be about how do we actually construct a migration system for this country that works moving forward, because we frankly don't have one. That's an issue we can explore further. Before I moved to DC 5 years ago, I was in New York, and I was leading, among the many things, leading work on immigrant integration efforts in different cities across the country. Actually, at that time, working with then Mayor Bloomberg, who has New York City has one. The Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York City is bar none unbelievable, and doing work to promote at a city level why immigrants are so important for local economies, and especially going beyond the gateway cities. I think this is where I'm going a little bit off topic for a moment, but this is some of the challenges that we see, the resistances, because in some ways immigrants had historically only gone to what are called the gateway cities. They go to Chicago, they go to Miami, Los Angeles, Houston, New York. And what you started to see back in the 1990s were immigrants going to Nashville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, Des Moines, Iowa, and this inability at a municipal level to really think through how do we integrate those immigrants and really capture those benefits. And we did a lot of work on the many contributions that immigrants bring to the cities that they come to, helping to revitalize Main Street. Scores of examples of small towns across the United States that were really decrepit, businesses were shuttered, and that was until they started receiving large influxes of migrants. So incredibly important for the future of this country is not only that correct immigration system, but also the importance that the immigrants have in small towns and large cities. And that's frankly severely with the dialogue and the rhetoric currently. It's not only underappreciated, but it's frankly tragic that we don't recognize that. For the task force, so we started the challenge that oftentimes becomes, and this is a challenge for all of us who are so passionate about Central America and frankly about Latin America overall, is that it's hard to capture, whether it's administration, whether it's Congress, or whether it's U.S. public opinion attention on issues. And so 2014 was that seminal moment to be able to to capture attention. And excellent work was done by the Obama administration, by folks like Juan and Michael and others who were serving at that time. Looking ahead, what are the key opportunities when you have a transition in government is to be able to give from all of you from civil society, give recommendations to the next government about things that can work better. So we saw a real seminal opportunity in doing so with the 2016 presidential election. I think that one thing that oftentimes a challenge we have in this town is we think about the solutions for the region from Washington, but we fail to talk to the people actually in the region about what are the solutions that work for them. So we started this task force that included U.S. Policymakers, business, but also, even more important, Guatemalan, Honduran, and Salvadoran policymakers and business leaders to think through what could be recommendations for the next U.S. administration, and as well as, importantly, what are things that are recommendations for the countries themselves. Because if you look around where the U.S. has influence around the world, and maybe I'm just I'm jaded because of my perspective, but I think actually the U.S. influence Central America, the Northern Triangle, is one of the top places in the world where the U.S. has significant influence, because what the U.S. does really, really matters in the region. And so the work that State Department or the Vice President's office, the countries listen. And so coming up with a task force with recommendations, going down to the countries, and it was critical to have recommendations both for the U.S., but also those recommendations for the countries themselves. John Kelly was a co-chair of this effort prior to joining actually, I reached out to him after he left Southcom. He was busy, I think when I talked to him the first time on this, he was fixing his cars in Virginia, and was enjoying retirement, and began a part of this effort. But also, very importantly, in some ways more importantly, is also led by the former Vice President of Guatemala, Eduardo Stein, a former Minister of the Presidency of Honduras, Luis Cosenza, and an amazing former Foreign Minister of El Salvador, Mayu Brizuela. And so really having that core effort. So what do we focus on? We focus on the three things that are pivotal for the region moving forward. Sustainable economic development, rule of law, and security. And these, no surprise, I see Juan shaking his head yes, and Michael as well. These are all these mirror what the U.S. strategy has been on Central America. They frankly will mirror the plan of the Alliance for Prosperity. But we didn't choose them because they mirror what other policies put out. We chose them because these were the topics that the members of the task force, the countries themselves, said was critical. And they are because I think what the big challenge in the region is that there is a natural gravitation toward a security and rule of law focused approach. And that security is a short-term mandate for a long-term problem, right? I teach at GW. One of my former students is here, and we spent quite a bit of time looking back at the history. You have to know the history of the country to know what the solutions must be, right? The concentration, the incredible concentration of wealth in countries is one of the reasons that you do not have the prosperity. The over-reliance on a small number of export crops, coffee among them, is one of the reasons that you have lack of economic prosperity. Rule of law, yes, where does that come from? Well, in El Salvador, for example, you never really had a full implementation of peace accords. That whole process of national reconciliation never quite happened 20 some odd years ago. And so a lot of the challenges that we're seeing today, and then you magnify that by other natural disasters, right? So the Hondurans are here on TPS, Hurricane Mitch in 1998, the Salvadorans major earthquake in 2001. So you take the the fact that there are major economic challenges, greater concentrations of wealth, lack of opportunity for the broader population that's been there for decades, rule of law challenges that are a result from years past, as well as the historic security challenges, and then the fact that the illicit the narcotics trade has increasingly centered on Central America, especially when you started to have advances in Colombia. So we focus on what are recommendations on how we can be improving more sustainable economic development, rule of law, and security. I can get into a little bit more of what we specifically looked at. I want to keep it broad for now. So I'll stop for that, Michael.
Great. Yeah, terrific. And we'll look back and hear a little bit more. So Jason mentioned, Claudia, the importance of hearing what Central Americans have to say. We won't ask you to speak for all of Central America, but maybe to speak to Guatemala, to your experience there. Maybe you can say a little bit about what you were doing and what brought you here, but also just reflect on kind of where you see your country. There have been some really good headlines coming out of Guatemala in recent years. Certainly, a homicide rate that's been falling, police and judicial institutions that seem to be going stronger, and some high-profile anti-corruption wins, but also some real setbacks, and most recently some real concerns about the state of democratic institutions. I know you were up on the Hill today talking about that. So can you give us maybe a reflection on where Guatemala is and where it might be going?
Thank you very much for inviting me, especially Sergio for contacting me and inviting me to be in this panel. So these are topics that are really important, I think, that for all Central Americans and also for people here in the United States. I was a judge in Guatemala for 10 years, and I mean, while I was in that position, I never imagined the level of corruption that was inside the institution. During the 10 years that I was able to serve in that position, I saw corruption in different levels. And I always, one of my goals being a judge was to fight for transparency and the independence of the judiciary. Because I believe that if you have independent judges, you are able to solve the problems of the country. And I think that that's one of the main problems that we have in Guatemala, but also in other countries in Central America. Jason was talking about the history of the country, and I think it's important to understand that some of the countries in Central America went through long periods of civil war. Mm-hmm. And that is what destroyed institutions. The legacy of the Civil War was impunity, inequity, and insecurity. And we're still dealing with that. Even though in Guatemala and El Salvador, they signed the peace accords in the 90s, some of these agreements were not really respected. And we still have some reforms to do in our institutions that need to be made in order to the countries to work. So we have to ask ourselves, why is the people coming to the United States? I think that the migration situation that is happening here is because the people cannot really live in their own countries. They are forced to come here because they feel insecure in their countries or because they are looking for better future. In Guatemala, for example, we have a serious problem related to education. More than 2 million kids don't have access to middle school. And what is going to happen to these people when they grow up? You know, they're not going to have any opportunities. So the reason why they come here is because there is no other options for them in their own countries. Another real problem in the region, and I'm also talking about Guatemala, is the malnutrition problem. 50% of the kids of 5 years old don't have the nutrition that they need to develop. So those are the kind of problems that we have to look at. So I think that governance is key to the region. And we're talking here in the Association of the United Nations, and I think it's important to talk about one of the missions that the United Nations promoted in Guatemala, because the government of Guatemala asked for the United Nations help. And I'm talking about the Commission Against Impunity that was set in Guatemala in 2006. That commission allowed the Office of the Attorney General to do independent investigations. I think that because CICIG was in the country, they were able to prove how corruption works. And in 2015, Guatemala was in the news because it was able to prove how all the government of Otto Perez Molina, the former president of Guatemala, and all his cabinet were stealing from the taxpayers. One of the main cases is the case called La Línea, and it shows how they were stealing the money that came to customs. So I also have to talk about another case that I was involved, and it's a case against the former head of the Congress. Meanwhile, I was a judge. I was applying for the position of judge in the Courts of Appeals. And the head of Congress tried to bribe me because the political party in power, the political power of Otto Perez Molina and Roxana Valdetti, were in problems and they were being investigated for corruption. And they needed a resolution from my court that will protect them. In exchange of that, they were guaranteeing me the position as a judge in the Courts of Appeal. Instead of accepting that, I denounced the situation. I was able to record the conversation and press charges. But I have to admit that doing that in a country where corruption is so broad, I was able to do it only because the Commission Against Impunity, because the CICIG was in the country. And I was, in a way, expecting that they could do an independent investigation. And actually they did, together with the Office of the Attorney General. And after 2 years, the head of the Congress was sentenced to 14 years of jail for bribery and influence peddling. And I think that that case is important because it was before 2015. It was before all the other cases of corruption were presented. And it showed that the judges can do their job, that what CICIG did in the country was empower the judges in Guatemala, empower the prosecutors, empower the police. So the institutions can work when they feel safe. And that's one of the main problems in Central America, is the insecurity that people face. People are afraid. People are afraid of denouncing, people are afraid of the consequences that can have to stand against corruption. So I think it's important to back up all these efforts that the international community can do. I think that there is not another example of CICIG like that in other countries. We have something similar in Honduras, the MAXI, that is also an effort to fight corruption in Honduras, but this is a mission from the OAS. So it's quite different. But I think that it's worth to study and to analyze what has been the impact that CICIG has made in the country, and why is the president of Guatemala and the government trying to get rid of CICIG. The president of Guatemala has the power to renew the mandate every 2 years. And he has already said that he won't do it once more. He had to do it this year. So the mandate of CICIG was going to end on September 2019. But he abruptly, a few weeks ago, decided that CICIG had to leave the country. That's where we are.
Thanks, Claudia. That's great. I think because we are here with the UN Association, maybe it's worth pausing a little on CICIG, because I think it's beyond much doubt been the most significant UN intervention in Central America, certainly in the last decade. Juan, this is not the first time that a Guatemalan president has not been a huge fan of CICIG, shall we say, for reasons that are not a great mystery, having come under scrutiny by the UN Commission. You dealt with a situation not dissimilar to what we're seeing now with Otto Perez Molina, who Claudio mentioned, who's the president at the time, who was seemed dead set on not renewing CICIG's mandate. And I think it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on how the U.S. government engaged on that issue, how maybe it contrasts with what the U.S. government is doing now. But beyond that, I think understanding why it engaged. right? Why the U.S. saw it as important, not just for Guatemala, but for the United States, that this anti-corruption commission be allowed to continue its work strengthening rule of law and institutions in Guatemala.
It's a great question. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the work to ensure that CSIG's terms of reference were strengthened from the original agreement after the 1996 peace accords started under the Bush administration. Actually, it was a kind of a mid-level staffer that managed the assistance for the region, and I remember Tom Shannon actually, when he was Assistant Secretary, traveling to Guatemala to lobby members of the Guatemalan Congress to agree to the terms with the United Nations that would really create a strong organization. And as a quick aside, the idea with MASI in Honduras was always, we weren't super happy with the terms of reference that were agreed to, but we saw it as a beginning to something that could, have a proof of concept and then would be strengthened and more robust and would have more popular support, with Guatemala example as a model. Look, I think I've known every CC commissioner since they've come in, and I think one of the things I learned, I'm not an attorney, is that when you're tackling issues of this character, it is important to not just obviously build a case, but have a very good feel for what the political bandwidth will be for these sorts of cases. I think some commissioners have been excellent at it. Some have been have had more of a challenge. I'm a very big fan of Ivan Velázquez. I think when he went after two presidents, and then some parts of the private sector, there was just a huge backlash where I think he had too many fronts that united against him. The issue with Félix Molina, and the reason it was so important for us to be supportive of CC, was because I think we all started with the understanding or the agreement that ultimately we would want CC to leave Guatemala when it was ready. We saw that the contributions of CC were actually strengthening the public ministry. And the terms of reference of CC did not allow it to look at cases before the 1996 peace accord, but it strengthened the public ministry to the point where we started seeing for the first time the public ministry having the independence and the resolve to try these cases on their own. That for us was a huge milestone, and what we saw was a need to continue to support that trend and the clear results of CC to strengthen the domestic rule of law institutions of the country. I'll be very candid, is the Vice President Biden said directly to Pérez Molina in a meeting where he said, and I'm not going to quote him directly because it was a conversation, but he basically said, look, as the president of Guatemala, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's your choice to decide what's in the national interest of Guatemala as the president. However, if CC goes, don't count on our support. And he said that publicly, visiting twice Guatemala, and actually Pérez Molina from jail blamed Vice President Biden for being there. It shows, I think, to what Jason was mentioning, is that what the U.S. does at a senior level, I think, sends a very powerful message. And I think the several in Guatemala tried to find ways to kick out Ambassador Todd Robinson while he was there, but people knew that Joe Biden was essentially had a direct line to him and was backing him, and so the ambassador was able to work very close with CC, and the ambassador also went to these court cases that I think pissed off a lot of people, to have the U.S. ambassador there standing up for matters of human rights. I think that has stopped a little bit, and I think there's a debate right now that I frankly don't necessarily agree with, that CC maybe crossed the line. I think that's what the conclusion that this administration has come to, and that they need to respect the sovereignty of Guatemala. I think you can have a conversation about the role of CC and how it can be most effective to address the issues in the country, but I think that it's wrong to arrive at the conclusion that CC is no longer needed in Guatemala. And I would say that the role of CSIG is fundamental to the country's development trajectory. When we saw this massive mobilization in a country that isn't known for these types of mobilizations, you saw members of PASIF, you saw a spontaneous student movements, you saw these different groups that don't always play well together having this kind of public outrage against corruption. It sent a very powerful signal that we at least had not seen in the country, and I think that right now, unfortunately, there's a very clear counterattack against those forces, and I would hope that maybe the next president of Guatemala would be supportive of something like that. But I think that what happens in Guatemala will be a signal to the rest of Central America and other parts of the region that the matter of corruption is a relative issue and that the U.S. may or may not play a role. I will highlight just very briefly here is something that when I was in government that actually the Atlantic Council and Jason specifically really helped us with was really trying to understand how the private sector played a role in this conversation, but also in ensuring the success of any sort of strategy. And I think that what you're seeing in Guatemala right now, and I think it can't be underestimated, is while you have traditional economic elites that don't want a group like CSIG, you are seeing a lot of young people that are young kind of entrepreneurs and young businessmen that recognize that ultimately the profit proposition of a country that respects the rule of law is something that's really good for their bottom line, and that they have been vocal even though CSIG has been under attack. You see some very influential private sector people coming out and still taking a stand. I think that's an important signal that sends to us that this isn't over, that it's going to, I think, continue.
Great. Jason, let's maybe just to pick up there, but broaden the aperture. I mean, we get to hear a little more about the specific recommendations that came out of the task force, but also, in terms of kind of the approach. I think Juan was talking about this, the kind of the trade-offs sometimes. This is a region in which the U.S. wants to invest. We have a lot of influence. We feel directly the impact of failures of governance and economic development and insecurity in the region. But sometimes you're dealing with very imperfect partners. So in developing recommendations, which I'm sure were sort of technically perfect, did you also kind of wrestle with the practical challenges of you doing this in a context where, as we heard from Claudia, the leaders on the other end are not always driven by national interest, but rather by other sorts of interests?
I'll say any of the technical perfections is because of consultations with Michael and Juan and Claudia as part of the effort. I think Juan brings up an incredibly important point on CSIG, and Claudia mentions as well is the effective the importance of CSIG with whether it's La Linea or whether it's giving that greater assurance of the rule of law, giving that assurance to Guatemalans overall, and also as Juan said, of course Jim Morales wants CSIG out because CSIG is according to is delved into territory that is incredibly uncomfortable for the president, right? And so, but it's the importance of CSIG, I think, goes beyond. It's fundamental to the country itself and to holding leaders accountable and stamping out corruption in the country. But it's fundamental to private sector investment, right? Because CSIG gives that assurance of greater assurance of the rule of law, right? As Juan was saying, CSIG was created for strengthening of the judiciary in Guatemala. And why do companies invest in places where there is assurance of their investment, assurance of law, unless the potential return of the investment is so great that they're willing to forego the potential backlashes coming from rule of law. And to be honest, the return is not so great in Central America that companies are willing to look beyond the rule of law challenges. And so, what's critical, I think, it's one of the things that we looked in the task force, but from a business investment in the region, is how do we, when you look around the world, how do we incentivize not only domestic entrepreneurs to invest in their own country, which increasingly in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras to a degree, you have this next generation of business leaders, businessmen and women, unfortunately probably more men, that are really just investing in their country right now. But also it's about the U.S. private sector and how do you galvanize the U.S. private sector to be such a key player in the region. And one of the things that we looked at is just the fundamentals, right? I mean, you have CAFTA-DR, the trade agreement among the Central American countries plus the Dominican Republic. But even beyond that, you also need things like better infrastructure to actually get products to market, right? I mean, you can have the best rule of law, but if your export products can't actually get to market, then you're facing significant challenges. Corruption, right? I mean, businesses having to pay off multiple bribes to move products or to start, or frankly, even to start a business to begin with, is a severe impediment on investment in the country themselves. Also it's about looking at the region as an entirety rather than looking at each country specifically. Because you look at El Salvador, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, it's hard to make a case to your board of directors that this is this is the right investment decision to look at looking around the whole world. But if you look at the region as a whole, there is an incredible opportunity. And so how also can things be done? And there have been incredible steps in just the last couple of years on customs facilitation between the different countries that allows for products to move from market to market in an incredibly expeditious manner, as well as how do you develop some of those key sectors, right? How do you move beyond the traditional dependence on export, on a small basket of export products, and really amplify that to look at a variety of products in which the region can be more competitive through DR-CAFTA. When the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, now known as CPTPP, which always been Comprehensive Partnership for the Trans, something like that.
Wow, good job.
But when CPP was in the cards, I think probably all of us were getting visits from business leaders from the region that were incredibly concerned about the effects that would have on their exports, specifically textiles, and the competition with Vietnam. But I think that partly those visits, I think, go to the importance of diversifying economies beyond certain products. And it's also about how do you when you look at how do you people migrate, people leave countries, not, as Juan was saying in the beginning, they don't leave because they want to. This is not a choice. It's migration from Central America is most of the time it's because there is no other option, right? You're either fleeing violence, you're trying to save your life. The Maras came into your neighborhood the week beforehand, and they told you, pay us a weekly fee, or we're going to, attack your wife or your daughter or whatnot, or your kid goes to school and the gangs approach them at school and say, hey, join us, and if you don't join us, we're going to kill you, and then you have to pick up and leave the next day. You don't plan ahead a few weeks from now and when you're going to be leaving. And so people are forced to flee, and then others leave because of the lack of economic opportunity. They're both interrelated, right? Because why has there been such a growth in insecurity in the region, right? Why have Maras taken hold and others? I think that yes, there are some people who just naturally gravitate to a life of criminality, of course, but the high number of people who join, and previous job we did some work looking at private sector reintegration efforts of former gang members. They join because they have no other option. Not that they want to. There's no other option. And so if that economic investment can be channeled into countries, that not only provides opportunity for youth, the needies that neither work nor study. You're losing whole generations. See, this is incredibly important. We did some work a couple of years ago on a future study looking at Latin America in 2030, and found that in Central America, I think it's 2030 when the ratio of work, there's a higher ratio of dependents than workers, right? So this is kind of we're kind of in a boom few years, a population boom few years, and if the youth of all well, this was looking at the region overall, so Central America, if the youth don't have opportunities now, the consequences are going to be even more significant 10 years from now, 5, 10 years from now. And so we need to be thinking now, how do we, what kind of policies can we put forward so that the region is on the right trajectory 5, 10 years from now. And so it's all about, it's about human capital investment, it's about integration and infrastructure, it's about development of key sectors. You know, there's oftentimes this debate on I think on Capitol Hill when you look at how should U.S. assistance be given and whether it should be given to the targeting. Do you target the communities from which people are living, or do you try to prop up those communities, or do you try to prop up the intermediary cities so that you're essentially encouraging people to migrate within their own country and go from a small town where there might not be much opportunity to an intermediary city, or are you trying to just focus that assistance on the small town itself? And there's a variety of debates on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle on this. You know, we came down on the fact that well, basically this was a bipartisan effort. So we said vibrant setting communities and intermediary cities, but it shows the fact that there is a lot of tension here in the U.S. on how that should be done. Assistance should best be delivered, but I think oftentimes what the challenge is this lack of dialogue with the key actors in the countries themselves. But I'm very optimistic, and I'm incredibly optimistic when you look at this next generation of business leaders. Not everybody, but many in all three countries who are super committed. The Inter-American Dialogue, I think last year, Salvador Pais, was that last year, Michael? Salvador Pais, a Guatemalan business person who was incredibly committed to his country. And there are many other Salvador Paises who are out there, and these are the kind of people that I think all of us should be looking at as inspiration of what could be the potential moving forward.
Great. Claudia, maybe the last question for you, and then we should open it up, I think, to others. But you know, when you hear this conversation about the region in Washington, about migration, about what the U.S. should be doing, and how it should be engaging in your country and others, does it resonate? I mean, what do you think we're getting right about a place like Guatemala, and what do you think we should be doing differently?
Well, I think that there's moments in history where you can change the life of other countries. And we have many examples. Here, for example, the United States, when they were fighting for independence, they had to go to Europe and ask for the help of France. And that's how they were able to get the independence from England. And then after World War II, the United States helped Europe to rebuild with the Marshall Plan. And what we see now in Europe is something that the United States helped to build. So I think that this is a key moment for Central America. I'm also optimistic. I think that there is an opportunity to help the countries find a way to prosperity, to development, but we have to work for governance. And I think that that's the key. And that's where we should put our focus on. Juan was talking about sovereignty, about how, you know, this CICIG issue is being harming the sovereignty of the country. We have to remember that it was the Guatemalan government who went to ask to the United Nations for help because they were feeling that they could not handle organized crime. And I think that the countries of Central America are hostage of organized crimes. We are in a geographical position that is very important for commerce. And I'm not talking only about illicit commerce. I'm talking about, you know, organized crime is passing 80 to 90% of all the cocaine through Guatemala before going to Mexico and to the United States. So why is these countries important for them? They want to control the institutions because they want to guarantee impunity for their actions. So I think that we need to look at how the institutions are resolving the problems. If we don't strengthen the institutions and all, not only the judicial sector institutions, the institutions that have to deal with customs, the institutions that have to deal with different issues, we are not going to solve the problems in Central America. I think that's key, and that sovereignty has to be seen from another perspective. It has to be seen as a way of cooperation between nations. What we see in other countries, like in Europe, for example, is that they have a different way of dealing with sovereignty. They make the laws work for international laws work different, and that's what we need to implement in the countries of Central America. We're talking about small countries. If they want to be competitive, they have to work as a region, not as a country, because that's also another point of view. So I think that there's many things that can be done from the United States to the region, but you have to involve the people over there, and of course the private sector is extremely important. Without the private sector in the table, things are not going to be done. So I think that will be my message.
Great. Well, I think as you can see, there is not an issue Central America related that these three can't answer. So the floor is open. We've been very Northern Triangle focused, I think, particularly because of the migration angle, but feel free to address other issues. Nicaragua has now come up, and there's some things happening there that I think we're all paying attention to. So really the floor is open, and the floor is wide. So adelante. Sergio.
I think I will start.
All right.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of you for coming tonight with us. I'm extremely grateful for your presence, and I think all of us have been delighted to listen to you. I think all of you bring very valuable experiences on the field, working on the field on these pressing issues that our student nation started to hear about what is going on in Central America. And I think I will start with the questions, maybe mostly directly for now for Jason and Juan. And I think there are broadly discussions about the future, as we have seen, about the CSIC and also the plan for the Alliance of the Prosperity. So today I was also in the morning at a public hearing at the Foreign Affairs Committee at Capitol Hill. Basically, one of the questions is basically what can Guatemala or even Central America as a whole learn from other models that have been implemented in the region. For instance, the model in El Salvador or Honduras, or how those countries can share experiences so they can reinforce all the strategies and impact that they aim to achieve in this particular regard. And with regards to the plan for the Alliance, I think one of the questions is what is the future about the plan for the Alliance? Is it still going on, and what basically could it be expected in the medium or long term with this particular plan?
I'm happy to, yeah. I'm happy to go with you. I was happy to give it to you.
Oh, okay. I'll be quick. So I like to highlight the El Salvador example because it did well at addressing what I thought was one of the biggest challenges to implementation in country. One of the things that the U.S. did with El Salvador was they started this initiative called the Partnership for Growth. You may all be familiar with it. It didn't really have funding associated with it, but it was more how do you actually bring the whole of government together. How does the U.S. bring the whole of government together to really do essentially a deep dive in the needs of the country and have like maximum coordination? And out of that process, they developed a very robust multi-stakeholder model for prioritization that once the funding came in, we saw that the USAID mission and the implementation of El Salvador was perhaps the most effective because they were very good at bringing all the stakeholders to the table, private sector, the government, civil society, and we try to replicate that in Honduras and Guatemala, and I was surprised to see just how difficult it was to have those conversations in a way that was not adversarial, constructive, inclusive. And perhaps it was, El Salvador is very polarized politically, so, but particularly I would say in Guatemala, there were people that were criticizing it from all sides, and it took us a long time to get it to a point where we thought, okay, now it's kind of working. So we went through some fits and starts on the coordination side that I think still need to be improved. It's also just international donors have been providing assistance for a very long time. They still suck at coordination. I mean, even in the U.S. government, coordination was very difficult, but we would get together with the Spanish, with a bunch of different governments to talk about coordination. It's just so hard because of the way the budgeting system works. It's just very overwhelming to coordinate at that level, and I don't think we got it quite right. The future of the Alliance for Prosperity, I don't know. I think the alliance, the future, insofar as U.S. support, rests with the U.S. Congress. One of the things that we did in the final year of the administration is I actually traveled more to the Hill than I did to the region, because what we wanted to make sure is that regardless of who won the election in the U.S., that Congress would actually fill the vacuum during the interregnum between changes in administration. And in fact, when the Trump administration tried to cut assistance, it was actually a bipartisan consensus in favor of Central America that increased it. Where I fear this is headed is that I think that both Democrats and Republicans have serious concerns, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, on what's going on politically in these countries. And some have concluded that that we need to, it's no longer a good investment of U.S. taxpayer money. I think particularly after the announcement about CICIG, you had Senator Leahy saying no more assistance to Guatemala. I struggle with that as if you stop providing assistance, you stop having leverage. You're not actually supporting these programs. But how do you actually kind of pressure or influence the government toward a more constructive direction? I think that's something for academics to really debate as to what's most effective. I'm concerned that the political will in these countries is less than it was, I think, before, and that I think is going to reduce the zeal of the United States to I think continue supporting the levels that it has.
I'll take that moment to say I agree. I think Juan knows so well because he was so instrumental in the formation of the plan of the Alliance for Prosperity, which was the stop myself. I say the plan of the Alliance for Progress. I always do it. Plan of the Alliance for Prosperity. But I think one of the keys that this was the first moment when I think the three countries actually came together and said, we will work on a joint plan, right? The moment, the pushing from the vice president, the technical assistance from the IDB, and actually writing the plan. That was a marquee moment for three countries that have long had divisions, fought wars in the past, to actually say we're going to actually come up with a joint plan, and not only a plan that relies upon, although the plan itself didn't have numbers in it, but not only a plan that relies upon U.S. congressional support, but a plan in which 80% of the money was going to come from the countries themselves. And so a commitment to say, we're in this too, right? We're not just asking for U.S. taxpayer money, we're doubling down on our own commitment to a comprehensive plan that is not just a mano dura, security-focused effort, but it's looking at the security and rule of law and sustainable economic development and human capital and all the different things that are critical for the advancement of societies. I'm not that optimistic right now on where the plan of the Alliance for Prosperity is going for a couple of reasons. One was identifying the political challenge as well. I look at the debate TPS last year, and what you saw is when there was really the screws being tightened on the Hondurans and the Salvadorans, they weren't really coordinating their approach with the administration on TPS. They were each going at it alone, and I think that the way that U.S. policy has changed has been to force more of a go-it-alone approach, right? In the previous administration, where there was a real focus on how do we actually get countries to work together to solve challenges, now the focus is much more on picking winners and losers, and picking those countries that we want to work with, or those countries that Honduras was, I think, the first country that announced they're moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You can make the calculation of why. And then there's also the threat of losing leverage. I think it's difficult to have a conversation these days about the region if we don't talk about China, such an important player, increasingly important player in Latin America. I think that the Salvadorans and recognizing China and the response from the administration has, I think, probably even called into further question the U.S. partnership, and we have the real potential to lose that leverage, right? Because I think the Chinese are more than willing to step in with assistance, and that assistance is not going to come with human rights conditions. That assistance is not going to come with conditions on transparency, democratic norms, and so there's a real threat of kind of undermining many of the inroads that we've made. I think that and then the other challenge is just especially the current leadership in the three countries, this incredible divide between the different presidents and between where their kind of political views. Obviously, we have election in Guatemala this year, and election next month. Still January. Election next month in El Salvador. So I think that some of those political winds might be shifting, but that's also that kind of those political fissures have allowed for, I think, some of the opportunity for the plan to not come to fruition. Last thing to mention, the plan was developed very quickly, couple months, and so one of the there's a number of criticisms of the plan from civil society in all three countries, from the business community in all three countries, that they were not properly consulted as part of the plan. Now, there's consultation mechanisms that were built into the plan, and those consultation mechanisms are important. But there is also the urgency in coming up with the plan, which I don't fault by any means, but it also caused some backlash domestically within each of the countries. It's been difficult to get.
Sure. None of you has referenced Mexico and what's its role and player. When we started talking about having this panel and going back quite a number of ways, we too put it in the framework of, is it possible to have a Marshall Plan that takes advantage of the kinds of planning that have been going on within the region? Is such an intervention, even if it were possible politically or financially, would it be welcomed from the U.S.? And would it be a cooperative effort, or would that breed new challenges and new issues? But Mexico, since has, with its new president, begun to make that same kind of reference. Maybe there's a role we can play, or can we bring about the cooperation? Can it be on a massive basis? Can it be long-term and sustainable? Some reference to the U.S. maybe hoping the U.S. would play a role instead of just brick-batting about the issues. So could you talk a little bit about Mexico and what its potential is, or how that would be received, how that can influence the process? It would have been a hot rail, but maybe it's the neutral rail that can bring this about. I'm not sure what my perspective is. I'd like to know what yours is.
You go first. I go first. I think there's a couple of things. One is I think there's an incredible opportunity with Mexico. I think that Mexico has Mexican foreign policy had long seen Central America and Northern Triangle specifically as not its issue, right? That this is a Northern Triangle issue, and Mexico is going to focus on Mexico. So that actually began to change before President López Obrador took office on December 1. I was at the John Kelly was the DHS secretary. He organized in 2017, I think June of 2017, a security conference in Southcom. It was actually co-organized between the United States and between Mexico. The Mexicans were right there at the front of the table. Subsequent conversations, the subsequent meeting, I think, was then, I think it was September of 2018. It took some time for that to come together. The Mexicans were again there at the table. Trips to Mexico, talking to folks even in the former Peña Nieto government, they have increasingly seen the role of Mexico as vital and important. And I think President Lopez Obrador opens a huge opportunity. He is, I would say singular, he's incredibly focused on bridging that divide between what's oftentimes referred to as the two Mexicos, right? Southern Mexico and Northern Mexico. Southern Mexico that is historically underdeveloped compared to the north. The president is from Tabasco and the south. And so he sees the development of southern Mexico as being fundamentally intertwined to increasing prosperity in the northern Guatemala and the northern triangle more broadly. So I think that there's an incredible opportunity there. His focus is in a longer term. We need to put in place the conditions, as he's talked about the Marshall Plan for Central America. We need to put in place the conditions to allow for this growth and this prosperity to come to fruition. And I think that this is potentially an opportunity for collaboration with the United States. My concern there is the fact that I think that the time horizons between the U.S. administration and the Mexican administration are not necessarily in sync. The Trump administration wants people to immediately stop leaving their countries, and Mexico sees the solution as being a longer term. We have to put in place the conditions so that people stop leaving. So I think that on a 5,000, 10,000 foot level, there is this incredible opportunity now with we could talk about, I guess, Mexico, the Remain in Mexico policy and other things that we want to, but that there's an opportunity to think through development of the region. The challenge is the fact that I think that the U.S. administration's approach is less on development right now, and it's more on just stopping people from leaving. But I think that broader focus that AMLO has, President Lopez Obrador, is something that frankly is very much in sync with, at a higher level, with many of the policies that we've long talked about in the United States, right? That this is a long-term solution that requires that key investment for future prosperity.
I'll just say, very briefly, I would say that while the Peña Nieto administration did undertake a temporary worker program to ensure that people in Guatemala could work in Mexico and flow as a way to discourage migration, by and large, under our administration and the Peña Nieto, the focus was primarily on enforcement. So I think I got to recognize what this administration is trying to do, and particularly just the strategic thinking of the Mexican foreign minister to counter what it disagrees with in terms of U.S. Immigration enforcement with an alternate, proactive and pragmatic proposal to addressing the root causes. Frankly, I struggle to think how they will be able to execute on the U.S.-Mexico kind of asylum agreement, given how underfunded the Mexican Migration Agency is and how ridiculously expensive it is to house migrants. But I think this is also a recognition by Mexico that now that they are prospering economically, the migration problem is not just the United States, where they are passed through. They're having people actually stay in Mexico. I honestly, I hope they do follow through with it, but I think Mexico economically is going to run into some challenges on the execution side. But I think any sort of region-led solutions to these challenges are music to our ears, not just on the government side, but then you have, I'm sure everybody here has heard of NGOs like Glasswing International, which are originated in the region, are proposing any sort of region-led development are things that particularly I get excited because, as a former U.S. policymaker, we were everybody's problem and everybody's solution, and so to these issues, and so when you have the region say, look, we have our own proposal, we're going to put in our own money, we're going to tackle these challenges, it's something that I can't help but get excited about, and I hope they follow through with it.
No.
Let's take. Why don't we take these three, and we'll come back to our panelists for final comments, and turn it over to Sergio. So maybe you start.
I'm Christina Hansen, Vice President Programs for UNA NCA. I'm actually pleasantly surprised to hear so much optimism on the panel tonight.
That's because I'm not talking.
Oh. Well, maybe in your closing arguments you could depress us all again. So my question is, when we're talking about sustainable development, you all seem very optimistic about there's opportunities with governance and improving there and rule of law, and a lot of capital investment of the business community. My concern is actually equitable development, making sure that certain peoples aren't left out, particularly indigenous peoples, especially given language barriers, education barriers, and other discrimination. What measures can we take to make sure the development lifts all people?
Great. Question in the back.
So the International Monetary Fund said that the economy of Nicaragua will grow 4% until 2022. My question is, how does the political problem in Nicaragua will affect the Northern Triangle? Thank you.
Going back to your observations, this is a UN Association panel. I wanted to ask further and explore further the implications of the UN involvement in Guatemala, and particularly here from Claudia Escobar, what lessons she thinks should be drawn from that experience, both within Guatemala and the Northern Triangle countries as a whole, as well as by the UN itself, not to mention the U.S. government.
Terrific questions. All right, let's take one more.
I have one question specific for Dr. Escobar. What is the scenario or after all elections are coming soon, at least in Guatemala, and so what is the scenario right now after CICIG was kicked out, and in terms of how much tangible the commission left in Guatemala? My perception is that not too many reforms or the necessary reforms to the judiciary system and to the constitution were made in order to guarantee progress and a real change, a tangible change in the country. So what is the scenario with this, or what is your opinion?
Okay. Kelly, let's start with you.
So I think that it's important to understand that the United Nations has been involved in Guatemala for many years, even before CICIG. Since the peace accords, for example, they were helping the country to get to the agreements. Then they created this mission that was called MINUA, and MINUA was helping during a few years to make sure the agreements were respected and some reforms were made. And we also have in Guatemala one office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that also is very involved in the country and helps in many difficult issues. And now we have the experience of CICIG. I think that even though CICIG was kicked out, the mission hasn't ended because it will end until September. So some people that are not able to be in Guatemala, they are working from outside of Guatemala, and they continue doing the investigation that they have. In a way, they have promoted some reforms that are important, especially during the first time of CICIG, because they were able to create new legislation that they needed to do the investigations. So they promote like from 10 to 12 different laws that were implemented and that were needed. Of course, we need bigger reforms in the judicial system, especially in the way that judges are elected, in the way we can guarantee the independence of the judiciary, And those reforms were promoted a few years ago, and they were not passed in Congress because there is no political will. So I think that we have to push for that, and that is up to Guatemalan people. And I think that now more people from Guatemala understand why it is important to pay attention to what happened in the justice system. Before that, this was an issue that only lawyers care. Now we have organizations of students that are, interested in what is happening. We have a lot of NGOs that are paying attention to that. Even now, there is an organization that was created that is Pro Reforma, that are pushing for the reforms. And that is very important that we continue promoting the judicial reforms that are needed. I think that's something that we still have to do, but that we can do. And I think that the job that CICIG has done for 10 years, it will stay in the country because the Ministerio Público worked closely with CICIG. They were not working alone. They could not do anything without the Ministerio Público. That's part of the agreement, that they work together. So the people that work with CICIG, they have now the capacities to continue the investigations. But of course, we need to protect the judges. And right now, the biggest challenge is in the Constitutional Court. The government of Guatemala wants to destroy the Constitutional Court. They want to get rid of the judges, and that's something that we have to pay attention, and that's why we were today in Congress talking about what is the future of the rule of law in Guatemala if the government doesn't respect the decisions that the court made. In any country, all the problems are going to the courts, and the decisions of the court is the last decision. Nobody discussed that. So the president cannot decide when he will obey and when he will not obey the courts. That's a big challenge right now.
I'll pick up, Christina, in your important question on the equitable development. Was it Guatemala specific?
That's what I had in mind.
Yeah, that's what I have in mind too, right? When you think about Guatemala, you think about this huge divide between the Western Highlands and the East, and frankly, the racism that exists toward the indigenous population in Guatemala. You look at any of the different, quite as much of the different statistics, but education statistics, which includes enrollment or completion, or when you look at literacy rates, look across the board, and the numbers are, I don't have it on my head, but they're significantly lower for the indigenous population versus the other. And actually, one of the key issues, and I did a panel a couple of years ago, the OES and the Guatemalan vice minister was on the panel, and her main issue at that point was malnutrition, and this is something that in all these policy conversations we sometimes overlook and think about what's really vital to the actual people, but the nutrition challenges in Guatemala, especially with the indigenous population, are huge. And as everybody knows, a lack of nutrition at an earlier age. This is one is making sure that his 4-month-old son has proper nutrition, has a 4-year-old daughter. But it's so vital, right? And so equitable development is about. I think about a few different things. I think about economic development, but I also think about that development in a very nascent stage of life, because even before getting to primary school, oftentimes a child's trajectory is set for the rest of their life, and so what type of interventions can be made to improve that trajectory at an earlier stage? Were you raising?
Yeah. So one of my sort of a counter question of that is in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, we've seen the resources increase for stunting and malnutrition, but the indicators have plateaued over the last 5 years. We haven't seen an improvement in health and nutrition. So, one of the things I learned when I was recently in Guatemala is that a lot of that has to do with the municipal level health departments aren't receiving their funding from the district or department levels, and their health system is decentralized. So at the municipal level, their health department doesn't report to the Ministry of Health. So that even though these resources exist, they're not being funneled to the right people. And even though the service delivery is there are still like hundreds of thousands of children that aren't receiving the vital nutrients they need, or there are so many mothers not receiving antenatal care, especially in the Western Highlands and especially in these indigenous populations. So like, what is the solution to that if the resources exist and the aid is there, but the indicators have plateaued?
Thank you for your points. That's a fantastic. But I unfortunately don't have the answer to exactly how do we fix that. But it is a severe challenge that the resources that are allocated just simply don't reach. And it is part of it is the way that the opportunities are communicated. Making sure that opportunities are always communicated in all the different indigenous languages, that there is as well not only communication of resources, but also the basic health guides, new developments, that those are all communicated. Low literacy, so they're being communicated in the right indigenous language. Are they also being communicated with the people actually understand, whether it's oral or through community forums and whatnot? So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there to make sure that assistance is reaching.
So I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer in the northwestern highlands of Guatemala, in the very communities that actually migrate to the United States. If you've ever been there, you take the road up to Todos Santos, stop by the comedor in the middle of nowhere, and then walk in for 4 hours, and that's where I live. And I'll tell you, I mean, to your point is, if you went down to Huehuetenango, you saw at the municipal level that there was people were getting services. You did notice a total lack of capacity at those centers, despite the government funding that they received. But then, when you went up to my community, teachers showed up once or twice a week if the kids were lucky. Access to health. One of our dearest neighbors in the Peace Corps, she died of diabetes, but it was a very treatable thing that wasn't diagnosed because she didn't have access to doctors. Infant mortality rate was through the roof because due to very basic things, diarrhea, or malnutrition, it didn't need to be that way. I think part of it, maybe this is just my Peace Corps kind of, I read Better Fruit and I was kind of pissed off at the government but I felt like, frankly, the municipal governments didn't care about the rural indigenous communities. There weren't metrics or, deliverables that at the local level that they had to produce on. So I saw that, and then fast forward to my time in government, when we were talking about providing assistance specifically to Guatemala, the argument we had with the government was the government said to us, no, you need to strengthen the export sector so that we can keep growing. And this is what you were talking about, the debate about what is best for the overall development of the country. And we were saying, no. Nobody's migrating from some of these communities where you have the port towns. They're migrating from the ones where you see a total vacuum. But I don't know what the answer is, because you've had, even before the Alliance for Prosperity, you've had huge investments in the Triángulo de Xil, and yet you're not seeing sustainable progress. I think it's also part of it is, frankly, the low effective tax rate that Guatemala has, and the fact that in some ways some of these countries have outsourced their development to the international community, and so there's no sort of skin in the game or responsibility that they need to invest in. And again, my initial comment kind of is the status quo is one that favors the economic elite of these countries, where if these people migrate, they send remittances, fuels consumption, they make money. I don't think there's any sort of commitment for those communities because they don't contribute to the GDP growth of the country.
Well, I think that there's also another problem, and it's the lack of capacities in the institutions. When every 4 years there's a new president and they change everybody in the minister, they have to start again to learn what is the problem there. So we need to create laws to promote civil service. That's something that doesn't exist in Central America.
There's not a civil service law.
There's not a civil service law. So you don't have the people that creates the policy that will know how to fix the problem. That is one issue, and the other issue is corruption.
Yeah, I was gonna say there was like a lack of accountability. I know like the commutes, they're sole mandate is WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene, but there's been 0% delivery on those indicators in the past 3 years. So even though they're receiving the funding to implement WASH programming, there's been 0 results. And like Huehuetenango, it's maybe in the major city you'll see that, but if these municipalities that you have to walk 4 hours to get to that have roads that are difficult to travel to, there's just absolutely no progress.
So it's a complicated problem, but I think that it has those two things, corruption and lack of capacity.
Yeah, I would just, Juan mentioned this quickly, but the tax take issue really is something that matters, right? So the amount of money that the central states and certainly the Northern Triangle countries are taking is low by global standards, and the resulting investments are also low. So like El Salvador, which has no real natural resources, the only thing it has going for it is its people, and it's underinvesting, even by Central American standards, in education. Right? Like, how does that make any sense? El Salvador's GDP growth last year was basically attributable entirely to an increase in remittances. So the best growth industry in El Salvador is exporting its people, and the best, as a result, the best policy. If you're a Salvadoran policymaker, I mean, and you're given a truth serum, and you say, how do I make my economy grow? It's by forcing more of my people to leave, right? Which is a pretty. This is why maybe the cynic in me is coming out a little bit. But you look at some of those the decisions that are being made about how money is spent and how much money is taken in and how much especially the economic elites are insulated from their responsibility to contribute to the future of their countries and the common good. And that's where, for me, it breaks down a little bit in terms of how do we get the buy-in we need at the local level for what we're doing, hopefully from this side, to be effective. So wanted to just underscore that point for you. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for your terrific questions. And Sergio is going to make all of this make sense. Send us home happy and optimistic into the cold. Right?
I'm trying to do my best to wrap up everything. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think we can keep here for hours talking about several issues. But that is something that I'm going to mention about because, well, first of all, before wrapping up our event, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight. Special thanks for our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Michael, Juan, Jason, and Claudia for being here tonight. I think yes, thank you. I also want to thank our UNSCA staff, Andrew, and all of our colleagues, members, volunteers who are supporting us here, and we wouldn't have this event without their valuable support. So I please accompany with giving the And yeah, just a couple of thoughts. Basically from one, basically I learned that basically here in America we also need to kind of understand how to fix our migration system. I think you were very valuable in driving us to this particular thing that sometimes we don't see this kind of this side of the problem, but it's important to keep it in mind. And I think along with this, it's important to keep into consideration what we can learn from other plans, such as Plan Colombia, or others to enforce already bipartisan initiatives that are in place, such as the Plan for Alliance. And I think we have seen a couple of initiatives that have been produced in Congress, such as the Humanitarian Affairs Act that was introduced in Capitol Hill last year, and others that I think they will generate a very important debate during this year. Also, we need to keep in mind all the actors that come into place, especially to promote sustainable development, migration, and governance. And I think Jason was very valuable for again reminding us the crucial importance of the private sector that come into place. I think that makes me think that this is one of the series of events that we are planning to basically engaging experts and practitioners in these topics, especially with the several holistic topics that are part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda. I think at this moment we focus on our conversation more in the angle from migration, governance, peace and security. We are also planning to bring experts from private sector, and I think there is another panel that we plan to have at some point between March and April, and definitely we will keep you all posted about it. Claudia, it was very valuable to learn also from your experiences, especially on the ground. I'm also originally from Guatemala, Central America, some of you know, and I remember all the work that the very admirable work that Claudia Escobar was doing when she was serving as a magistrate for the Court of Appeals in Guatemala and as a judge. I think it's important, especially here, because pretty much of the topics about Central America are geared towards transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, and citizen engagement, which is really important. And here at the UNACA family, we have a network of activists that are basically promoting human rights, advocacy strategies to promote transparency and accountability in different regions across the world. And I think it's important that we focus in this particular moment in Central America. So, in this particular angle, I think basically we'll keep you all posted about these events and others that can happen after this. With this, I think I would like to conclude the session. And thank you so much. I think we will have the room for more 10 to 15 minutes in case some of you want to talk with the panelists and ask them more questions, and if they will maybe mingle with anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you.